Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be talking about buying logs and getting them turned into your own lumber. Now this is something that is a brand new experience for me, and I wanted to talk about it and share it with you guys because it was such an interesting learning lesson for me, and I think it's something that everyone should definitely try. So this is just one of the many pieces that I got out of this little whole escapade that I was going on here, and this is some apple or pear wood. When I talked to the sawyer, we're kind of unsure of what actually wood it is. He thinks it's pear wood, but the people that I bought the logs from say it's apple wood. So there's just some minor confusion there, but either way, it's a very rare and very special wood because you can see it's got this beautiful dark center heartwood and this lighter, almost pink sapwood. So it's a very beautiful wood and quite uncommon. Especially out here in the prairies, we don't have a whole lot of hardwood options. So when you see stuff like this, it definitely piques your interest. And that's why I ended up with all this lumber that I have now. So to kind of run through the story, basically it all starts when I saw an ad on Facebook Marketplace just for a whole bunch of applewood logs. These people had obviously just cut down a tree, had the logs stacked there, and just wanted to get rid of them, but they were charging a decent amount of money for them. So these people initially wanted 50 bucks a log. I messaged them saying, hey, I'll give you 40 bucks a log and I'll just take all of them. They said, great, come get them tomorrow if you can. I went with my truck, picked them all up, brought them home. Now, the funniest thing about this is that it took a lot more effort to pick these up than I thought it was going to. Because when I was looking at the ad, I thought that these logs were a lot smaller than they actually were. The ad said that they were all in about 4 to 5 foot sections. So I assumed by looking at the picture, which I should have downloaded the picture, so I should show it in the video here, but I totally forgot to do that, and now the ad is gone. But in the picture, these logs looked like they were at most, 6 to 7 inches wide. When I actually got on site, I found that the widest one there was about 12 inches wide, and the other ones, most of them were well over that 6-inch width that I was expecting. So to say the very least, these logs were extremely heavy. So me with my little Ford Ranger had quite a bit of trouble. I had to do a couple of trips in order to get them back to my house here because just in loading up the first 4 logs, my truck was already squatting quite a bit. So that was a very interesting experience just in and of itself. And trying to figure out how to move these logs around by myself because the people that I bought the logs from were not capable of helping move the logs. So I had to move these logs that weighed probably upwards, 200 to 300 pounds a piece. I had to figure out how to move them and get them into my truck, the bed of my truck, by myself. So that was a very interesting experience. As you might be able to tell by my forearms here, I got pretty beat up in the whole process. But again, that was not one of the biggest concerns here. And so one of the important things that I want to mention about this first part of the story is the price you're paying for these logs. Now, there are a lot of things that go into buying a green or freshly cut log that can make them worth actual money or just make them landfill wood. So these logs that I bought here were nowhere near worth that $40 a piece mark. Now, the first issue is that they were cut down 2 weeks ago before I was able to get my hands on them. So in that 2 weeks, they had already done a lot of drying out. Typically what I found online is that you want to try and get logs cut as quickly as possible. So the fact that these were just kind of sitting on the ground for 2 weeks is kind of a downside, and I probably should have asked for a little bit of extra money off that. The second thing is the ends were not sealed when they were cut off. So anytime you're cutting a green log and you're wanting to use it for actual wood, you always want to either paint the ends with some latex paint or use some end sealer like I did on them when I got them, which is just basically a wax compound that helps seal at the end and keep the moisture in. Because what happens is all the moisture right around the ends here escapes really quickly, and then you're left with a very high moisture content in the middle here. So then this leads to a lot of cracking near the ends of your pieces here, and then you're usually left with pretty good wood in the middle here. But if you go through and seal all your ends, you can control some of that cracking that goes through. So if these people had cut down the tree and it only been a day or so, had painted the ends and all that with just some simple latex paint, these logs may have been worth that at the price. But one of the biggest factors that I completely forgot to check on site was whether or not this tree was dead. I should have asked the question, was this a living tree or a dead tree when you cut it down? Because very quickly looking at these logs, I could have found out that most of these logs had pretty significant rot to them. Now this is one of the sections that's right near the top of the tree. It's the main kind of crotch section. So it was doing pretty well. But one of the lower logs was completely rotted out. And I paid 40 bucks for that log that is basically completely worthless. In fact, this is the log in question where you can see this whole outside here is completely rotted. There is still some good wood on the edge here, but overall, I should not have paid $40 for this, basically garbage log. So that's one of the most important things. If you're actually paying somebody money for these logs on site, double check them. Always check both ends, make sure that there's no rot. Before you ever hand over any money, make sure that your logs are not like this one that was fully rotted through and very obviously rotted. Because all I had to do was look at either end of this log and I would have caught on to the fact that it was fully rotted through. Now again, I'm going to take that as a good learning lesson for my own part. I plan to do this a lot more in the future. And in those cases, if I am paying somebody for the logs, I would definitely take the time to check them. Now I'm emphasizing the point that if you're paying for them, obviously you want to check. If you're not paying for them, just take whatever you can get. Realistically, all of these logs were destined for the landfill. These people knew that, and they were just trying to make a quick buck off it. Because I know that the older gentleman, he was a carpenter, so he kind of had an idea what this wood might be worth. The only problem is he knew what the wood might be worth without actually doing any of the stuff that made the wood worthwhile. And so on the log side of it, I got deeply ripped off. Realistically, I did these people a favor, since seeing how they wouldn't have been able to move these logs themselves and take them to the landfill and all that, they would have had to pay someone to do that. The fact that I paid them $280 for these 7 logs, they got a very good deal. And it hurts me kind of every day since I started doing this, the fact that I paid them that much money for it. So be very, very careful. No matter how enticing the wood seems, make sure once you get on site, even if you've agreed to a price, online, whatever, in your texting or chatting, whatever, make sure when you get on site, you look at the logs and you can even walk people through it. Well, you didn't finish the ends. They've been sitting for X amount of time. There's obvious rotting. I'm doing you a favor by hauling this stuff away. All of that kind of stuff comes into play, because when we talk about the rest of the process here, everything else is really, comparatively inexpensive to the initial cost of getting the logs. If I'd gotten these logs for free, this would have been one of the best deals of my life. And even if I paid, $15 or $20 a log, that would have been a much better deal than what I got right now. Although this wasn't a horrible experience money-wise, I could have been a lot better just in that initial purchase of the logs. And so once I got all these logs back to the shop here, that's where things started getting really stressful, because now I had all these logs and I had no idea what to do with them, because they were way bigger, way thicker and chunkier and heavier than I thought I was going to be getting. So I realized that there was no way I was actually going to be able to work with them with the tools that I have in my shop here. And so my first thought was, I'll just go buy an Alaskan sawmill, which is basically just this jig that you mount onto a chainsaw and helps you make slabbing cuts to basically do exactly what I have here, where I'm getting these nice big slabs. The only downside is obviously you have to have a chainsaw, or you have to rent one. Chainsaws are bloody terrifying. They're still the one tool that I'm still very untrusting of, but eventually I will learn how to use one, I'm sure. And 2, they're just a massive waste of material. It's much like comparing the table saw to the bandsaw. When you're breaking down material, you're using a much thicker blade on that chainsaw compared to a bandsaw mill. And so when I sat down and started thinking about it, I decided that I wanted to take the stuff to a sawmill and get it cut down properly. And that brings us to one of the most challenging parts of this whole process, is finding a sawmill. Because again, here locally, we have a decent number of large sawmills. Because in the Calgary area, we're right next to the Rocky Mountains, where there's a lot of forestry that goes on, and stuff is brought back to these flatter areas where they can build these big manufacturing sawmill plants and that. So there are a decent number of large sawmills. The only problem is that those large commercial sawmills would never work with someone like me. I only have these 7 little logs that I need to bring and have them cut down. Chances are these big industrial sawmills aren't going to help me. So the trick is that I needed to find some of these smaller, mom and pop, old guy in the backwoods with a sawmill kind of deals. And speaking from my own experience here, these people are very challenging to find. Although it is quite common nowadays for people in, smaller rural areas to have these, portable sawmills, trying to find these people online is nearly impossible, because they're either not really into the online space, they're usually fairly old, fairly senior in their age, so they don't have a good connection to the internet, all that kind of stuff. So they're not really easy to find. Now, what I was able to do is I looked on Facebook Marketplace, Kijiji, Craigslist, just kind of generally Googling stuff in the local area, and I actually found 4 or 5 different little sawmills of just people that had these portable sawmills that were willing to cut down stock for me. And so of those 4 or 5 that I was able to find, 2 of them actually responded. And so between those 2 sawmills, one was $80 an hour for milling, the other one was $72 an hour for milling. I don't really know what I was expecting from either, so I just went with the one that was a little bit cheaper. But the one gentleman that I did go and work with was an amazing guy. Very helpful, very smart, very intelligent. He's probably, I think if I remember correctly, he said he's been, woodworking and just kind of generally milling wood and all that, probably since before my parents were born. So he's been at this a very long time. Super smart guy. And so his price was $72 an hour for milling, and even let me know that it would be probably close to a 2-hour job in order to do the milling. Just from his own experience, once I gave him some descriptions of what the logs looked like and that, he guessed it was going to be about 2 hours. So with that in mind, I decided to go with him because I had a better idea of what I was getting into, and it was a little bit less expensive. And so the timeline of this is all meant to happen really quickly. So I picked up the logs on a Wednesday, and then I went into the sawmill on a Saturday. So I tried to get the milling done as fast as possible because, again, when you have green logs like this, you want to try and get them cut and get them stacked and drying as quickly as possible to help prevent rot and damage to the wood and all that. So the sooner you can get them cut, the better off you're going to be in the long run. At this point, everything just kind of had to start coming together perfectly. And the one thing that I realized, in order to get these logs to the sawmill, I couldn't just use my truck because, like I mentioned, when I was bringing the logs back to my shop, just with 4 of the logs by themselves, my truck was already squatting. So luckily, having a pretty good quality truck, I have a 2007 Ford Ranger with a V6 4-liter engine, which is just about as good as those older generation Rangers get. I was able to just rent a simple trailer from U-Haul for $26 for 24 hours, and that let me carry all the logs I needed to. So that's one of my biggest tips if you're going to be dealing anything with green logs, is wherever possible, whenever possible, rent a small utility trailer to use, because that was astronomically easier loading these logs into that trailer, taking them to the sawmill. The whole experience of dealing with these logs using that trailer was way easier than trying to get them into the bed of my truck, because my truck has decent ground clearance, which means I had to get these logs that weighed more than I do up and into the bed of my truck. Whereas when using the small utility trailer, which has maybe 6 inches of ground clearance, I was able to just dead man drag these logs up the ramp of the trailer, drop them into this steel bedded trailer without any worry. There was so much, I don't know how to stress how much easier it was to do it that way. So definitely, if you're dealing anything with logs, just do yourself a favor, rent a small trailer. It will make everything easier. And I can confidently say that if you've never towed a trailer before, it is not nearly as hard as you expect. Reversing a trailer is much more challenging, but just driving with the trailer is not as hard as you expect. This was my first time ever towing a trailer, and it was a very heavy load to tow in a trailer over a very long distance at highway speeds. So overall, this was about as worst case scenario as I can imagine for towing a trailer for the first time, and it was not nearly as bad as I expected. I didn't have any issues along the way. Nothing went wrong with the trailer. Nothing went wrong with the logs or the load, and it was just pretty easy. So then once I had all the logs loaded into the trailer and I got down to the sawmill, this is where things started to get slightly interesting. And this is where it kind of showed where your different choices in sawmills might have a big impact. Because the gentleman that I went to, basically he just has his own private property and it was just covered in logs everywhere. He has this single driveway going up and he already had his truck and trailer parked in that driveway. So I couldn't drive my truck right up to the sawmill. So it meant that we had to move the logs from the trailer all the way up to the sawmill where he was actually able to do the cutting in that, which was a little bit on the annoying side. Obviously, I was expecting I would be able to, basically back up to the mill, drop these logs out, and there'd be 2 people trying to move these logs. But what it turned into is me using a dolly to haul these logs basically all the way up this guy's driveway. So that is where I think if I went to a different sawmill that was maybe, so that's where I almost think that if I went to the sawmill that was charging $80 an hour, maybe I would have gotten a little bit better service there. And again, that's where I did do a lot of the damage to my arms because I was trying to move these logs up this guy's driveway on a dolly. So that was a kind of annoying part of it. But again, it's just a case of, maybe the next time I'll try out that other sawmill that I didn't go to this time. Just one of those learning experiences. You want to experience different things, talk to different people, all that kind of stuff. And so I don't want to badmouth the guy that did the sawing for me because it was a really good experience. He was a really nice guy, just, genuinely a good person. And he really helped me out with a lot of just other stuff in general. So it was still a really good experience. It was just kind of that initial having to drag these logs all the way up to this guy's driveway again was kind of annoying. But once we actually started sawing the logs, this is where things started getting a little bit more interesting. And because one of the parts that I was most worried about with sawing these logs is I knew that applewood was a very dense hardwood. So I was afraid that the blade fees in that, which was an add-on to the actual hourly fee of using the sawmill, I was afraid that those blade fees would be what absolutely ruined me. I figured that the hourly rate of using the sawmill and all that was very fair, but I was terrified at what the blade fees would cost. Now, the whole time I was there, I never thought to ask the question, well, what are the blade fees of that? Which probably would have put me at ease pretty quickly. But when we were doing the sawing, we went through probably 7 blades. Whether they were getting dull, they just weren't cutting anymore. I think 4 of them just outright snap, which was not fun at all. If you guys think that snapping a blade on a normal bandsaw is scary, snapping blades on an open front bandsaw mill is a lot scarier. Luckily, I was well back from the machine, but it was still made a loud bang, quite an interesting situation. And we went through a decent number of blades, and I thought that this guy is just gonna kill me with the cost of these blades here. But luckily, if we skipped a little bit of the end of the story here, again, this is where him being just a really nice guy came in. He understood that part of it was just because his blades were very old, some of them were dull, and the fact that this is a very hard hardwood, he just liked the experience of cutting into it. He was just as happy to help me out as I was to help him out with, paying him for the sawmill time. So in the end, he only charged me for a couple of the blades that he had to resharpen, and not for the blades that broke, because like he said, unless there was a specific reason that he could tie it to the wood, something like a big nail or a rock in the wood that he hit with the saw blade that actually damaged the saw blade. The saw blades that broke were not really my fault. It was really just a case of old saw blades. And then the saw blades that didn't break obviously needed to be resharpened, so he just charged me a nice simple $12 a blade sharpening fee, which again I think is very fair, even compared to what I think you'd spend on blade sharpening in the city here, because this gentleman sharpens all his own blades. So all of that was a very good experience. But overall, sawing these logs, although it wasn't easy, obviously, like I said, we broke blades were popping off, all this kind of craziness was going on, the overall milling went really well. And so for most of these pieces, I tried to get it, and so when we were discussing how to best mill these logs, all I asked for was as much 8/4 stock as I could possibly get. Because I know in my shop here, most of what I'm used to working with my smaller projects, and even a lot of my furniture, is 8/4 stock is just generally the most useful stuff. The thicker the piece of wood you can deal with is always going to be better. So we milled this all to slightly over 2 inches so that when it dries, it'll slightly shrink down and I'll be left with basically 8/4 stock. And so even at that 2-inch thickness, this stuff is still decently heavy. And out of most of these logs, we were able to get 4 to 5 thick slabs. So this is one of my favorite ones. Again, like I said, it's from the crotch section of the tree, and there's just so much detail in here, and I can't wait to use this wood. And so there's only a few pieces that we weren't able to actually saw. One of them was this rotten log here. As the gentleman explained to me, when you cut through rotted sections like this, it's way harder on the saw blade compared to just cutting through a solid piece of wood like this. I thought that the rot would be really soft and would just kind of break away, but apparently you don't want to do that because it acts more like a sandpaper on the blade and dulls it really quickly. So cutting rotted sections like this is just really generally a bad practice. So all we did on this log is we just split it in half, and what I'm going to do over the next couple days here is I'm just going to try and dig out as much of this rotted section as I can and save as much of this good wood around the edges as possible. So I've got this half, and then I've got the other half, which is most of the rotten in. The other piece that we weren't able to cut, and I would pull it out and show it to you guys now, but it's at the very bottom of the stack, which was bad planning on my part. What happened with it is we took as much material off of both sides as we could, got it right down to a nice center point that was a little over 4 inches thick. Then we tried to make the cut right through the middle to break that into 2 pieces. And so what happened there is that we just could not cut that piece of wood. We tried to go from both ends of it, tried changing out blades, all this different stuff, and this piece of wood just could not be cut. The blade on the bandsaw kept deflecting downwards or upwards, just completely not staying in the cut. We tried sharp blades, new blades, all this different stuff, and it just could not cut. What kept happening is that the blade would pinch in the piece of wood and would get ripped off the mill. So you would get this loud pop. We both thought that the blade was broken. We'd go and check the blade. Nothing was wrong with the blade. So it was just a really interesting thing. Now what's going to happen with that piece of wood is it's still at that 16/4 thickness. So it's a nice, thick, chunky piece of wood that I can probably break down in the shop here and figure out how to use. Because even though his bandsaw mill wasn't able to work with it, within the shop here, my tools are much sharper. I have the blades that I use on my bandsaw are much different than the ones used on that bandsaw mill. So potentially I can still make use of it. And having it in that 16/4 thickness just means I can try working with a thickness of wood that I've never used before. So there's definitely stuff that I can do with it. I'm just going to have to do a little bit more figuring out how to work with that. So even there, not really a bad thing to be left with some of that thicker wood. But again, for the most part, all this wood was able to be broken down. I'm left with a pretty good amount of wood. I've tried pricing it out, comparing it to buying 8/4 cherry or 8/4 maple locally, the kiln dried stuff from the lumberyard. And I can easily say that the bang for my buck, when you take into account the amount that I paid for the wood, the amount that I paid for the trailer, the amount of gas that I paid and all the transportation here, and the sawmill fees, all of that combined together, depending on how this wood dries, it still is going to be a good deal over going and buying cherry or maple. Now, obviously, the one big downside to having your own lumber like this is that you have to dry it properly, which is one of the things that I'm not going to be able to do, because I don't have anywhere outside that I can stash this stuff for it to dry just in the air. So what you want is, if you're trying to air dry lumber, you want it in a place that's not going to have sun on it. You don't want it to get wet from the rain and the environment and that, and you want to make sure that it has wind blowing through it. I don't have anywhere to put these logs where I can do that, or I have enough space to make sure that I don't have any sun on it, have no rain hitting it, and have wind blowing through it. So all right now, I just have it stacked behind my table saw. You can kind of see the pile peeking out there. And all I'm doing is I'm just leaving a low power fan just kind of running all the time, blowing air through that. And then just through the way that we work here in Alberta, we're a fairly low humidity climate. And then I've just got an industrial heater in the garage here that when it comes on in the evening, very much so acts as a dehumidifier. Now I'm thinking this week sometime I'm going to order a dehumidifier just to put it in here, just to help remove a little bit more of that humidity from the air, because just coming into the garage right now, it does feel like a very humid environment. But that's something that I'm just going to kind of play around with, and we'll see if I decide to do that. I don't know if that's particularly necessary, especially because all I have to do is open the back door, and that just sucks all the humidity outside anyway. So it's not something that I'm super concerned about. And so drying time is where I still have no idea of what is going to happen, because most of these pieces at that 8-quarter thickness, theoretically, it should take about 2 years to dry. The only other pieces of green lumber I've ever bought was a couple pieces of birch. One was 3 inches thick, the other one was 4 inches thick. And I think they'd been drying for a couple months before I bought them. And when I brought them back to the shop here, they took a little over 6 months to fully dry out, or get to that kind of appropriate woodworking level of about 10% moisture content. But I'm assuming now that I'm being a little bit smarter with these pieces, I've got them stacked in an area with a fan blowing on them. We're constantly moving air through them, and they're only 2 inches thick. So I think that they will dry out fairly quickly. Again, I'm not going to be using these anytime in the near future, but when I bought these, I knew that I wasn't going to be touching them for at least a year or so. So if you guys were hoping to see some applewood projects coming out down the pipeline here, they're not going to be coming for a long time. And so when I thought about buying this wood, when I'm looking at it now, I'm thinking about it more as an investment into the future. I know that in a year or two's time, I'm going to get to work with some awesome looking local hardwoods. Even if I decide to move somewhere else, this wood can still come with me, and it's just going to be a really good memory, because this being the first time I've ever gotten my own lumber milled, it's just going to be awesome to work with. Plus, this stuff is absolutely beautiful. I've got a bunch of different pieces, all kinds of variety of grain structures, looks, all that kind of stuff. It's really just going to be an exciting experience once this stuff is all dried out and I can actually start doing some projects with it. All around, I have to say that it was a very good experience, and definitely something I would do again. I can't really do it for a little while here because obviously I don't have a whole lot of space to dry this stuff, but there are still some local woods that I'm looking for, mainly red elm, that I really want to try working with, or I really want to eventually try working with. So if I do see red elm logs pop up on Facebook Marketplace, I may just have to go through this whole process again, which now that I know how to handle most of it is going to be a pretty good experience again, I think. So if you guys have any questions or want to know more about, the way that I did certain things, how I dealt with like towing the trailer, stuff like that, feel free to leave them in the comments below, or you can always contact me through my website. I'm always happy to answer questions through email. But as always, guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Oh yeah, and so this is how everything's stacked here. We've got some 5/8 pine stickers all the way through these, so we've got nice thick spacing all the way through most of these sections. At the top here, I had to use some thinner ones just because that's what I had in the shop here. But overall, we've got a really good amount of lumber here. As you can see, those 7 logs that I talked about are now all in this section. We've basically got 2 columns right here. Everything's all held together. It's going to be sitting here for the next few months anyway, until maybe I find a better place to keep it. But yeah, this is the whole stack, and this is just some of the most beautiful wood I've ever seen.